Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Gruss, and welcome to this Space News web event to discuss the Space Force budget for fiscal year 2026. I want to set the stage quickly here. For much of the spring, we heard from Space Force leaders that they had increasing responsibilities. This came especially as China was advancing its own capabilities and that the Space Force would need more money. We knew Golden Dome, President Trump's uh, space initiative, was out there. And we weren't quite sure how this was going to look from a budget perspective. So what happened? The Space Force so far has received, there's bills to receive nearly $40 billion in fiscal year 26. And that's a whopping $11.3 billion more from last year. So today we're going to talk through some of those numbers and what to expect this budget process and what to look for as the bills go through the appropriations process on the Hill. I want to tell you that we have a panel I couldn't be happier to have here that they have taught me a tremendous amount about budgets. We have Todd Harrison from the American Enterprise Institute, Mike Tierney from the National Security Space Association, and Fletcher Franklin from BryceTech. I have a group of questions. I know that we're going to have a great conversation. My plan is to go roughly 45 minutes with some of the questions I have and then take questions from the audience, but we'll see what comes in when there's a lot to cover. So let's get started. And Todd, let's start with you. This is a little bit of the softball question, but what's one word to describe this budget and why?
Sorry,
There
I
we
was
go.
muted. Yeah,
There we go.
I so you missed my first word, which was disappointed.
Yeah.
That what looks like on the surface as a $40 billion Space Force budget is not. They get to that 40 billion only by including all the reconciliation funding that they think would come and be applied to Space Force accounts. Remind everyone, the administration didn't request this reconciliation funding. There is no follow-up plan for it. There's no long-term plan that goes with it. This was a one-time plus up that Congress forced on DOD, not something DOD actually requested any of the specifics. So what's really in the budget is a cut for the Space Force. They're only getting 26 billion this year. That's about an 8% cut. If you adjust for inflation, it's like a 10 or 11% cut, depending on what inflation measure you want to use for next year. So yeah, my word is disappointed. It looks like the Space Force, when you compare it to the budgets that the other services got in their base budgets, the Space Force was the biggest loser overall, which is not something that was expected.
Yeah. Mike, how about you? What's your word to describe this budget?
Thank you, Mike, and good to see everybody. The word that immediately came to mind to me was unprecedented, not just in terms of its overall top line, its year-to-year growth, but as Todd alluded to, its structure. We've now reverted back to almost like a base OCO type of structure with the request. Its timing, we've had late budgets, but we've never had a budget delivered so late and in such concert with congressional activity. And I think it's unprecedented in terms of some of the technologies and missions that it's going to enable, whether it's the Golden Dome mission, long-range space-based kill chains, a number of transformative technology investments. I think we'll get into some of the concerns that Todd raised relative to whether or not this is real growth or not, but whether or not you think it's real growth or not, it's certainly an unprecedented kind of unseen before budget.
Yeah. Fletcher, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And it's appropriate that Mike Tierney almost took my word because he taught me everything I know about the budget. So I'll go with dynamic. There are programs and processes that have changed here or are going to change as this process goes through the full appropriation cycle. There are new opportunities in here, programs that previously weren't palmed that companies, the entire industry is going to jump all over. There's some messiness in this budget request. It's a product of the timing of a new administration coming in and appropriations coming in and the reconciliation bill rolled into that. And I would also just point out the dynamics. There are programs that we weren't talking about just a few cycles ago that are now right here in the open. So I'm sure we'll get into some of that, but absolutely a dynamic budget, and it'll be a fun few months here going through it.
One thing I like to think about when we get a budget, when we get any defense budget, is what does this say about the administration's priorities? Meaning, what can we learn from this budget about how the White House, how the Pentagon leadership is thinking about the Space Force? So Mike, let me start with you on that one. What are some of your takeaways there from what we can glean on the White House's priorities for the Space Force?
Good copy. And this is where I would maybe start to, and I have tremendous amount of respect for Todd. And when Todd speaks, everyone should listen. And when Todd raises red flags and talks about risks, everyone should take it very seriously. And I do. But this is where, I think characterizing the big, beautiful bill, which is called the big, beautiful bill for a reason, as not a request from the Trump administration, and therefore you can divorce the big, beautiful bill reconciliation from this 26 base request, I think is slightly misleading, right? Because in the lead up to the release of the 26 request, everything was on hold relative to whether or not this big, beautiful bill would pass. So I view the administration's priorities through the lens of a combined request, because that's how they've presented it. It was aligned that way with Congress. Congress has said as much in the House Appropriations bill. So with that backstop, I think this is a tremendous, opportunity for the Space Force. They've been given new responsibility, new mission, new investment. And whether or not there's a risk, whether that's sustainable moving forward, given the budget mechanics that they've elected to use to provide that funding, I think is an open question, and really gets to the risk that Todd's talking about. But I think it's a generally hard to argue that putting $6 billion here, $4 billion here in new funding, whether it's in reconciliation or not, is not a shot in the arm and endorsement of what the Space Force has been doing. Over.
Todd, I guess I'll give you a chance to respond here, but also what do you see as some of those priorities, or how do you think DoD leadership is thinking about the Space Force maybe differently than they were 18 months ago?
Yeah, no, I mean, and I obviously have, tremendous respect for Mike Tierney. We've done many of these budget briefs together in the past, but here's an area where I just really disagree. While the one big beautiful bill, yeah, absolutely, that was the president's top legislative priority, but the defense funding that was stuck into that was not at the request of the administration. That was done entirely by members of Congress, particularly Chairman Rogers and Chairman Wicker of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. They're the ones who drove that. They're the ones who put the money in it. The administration did not request the $150 billion. They did not send anything over to say, this is where you should put the money. They had discussions back and forth, of course, but it was not requested in the formal sense. So I set aside reconciliation money for defense, and I view that as congressional priorities, right? That shows you what Congress thinks is a priority. And then the fact that the administration tried to take credit for it in the 26 budget request, I mean, that infuriated the Republican members of Congress. Senator Wicker, was very forceful in saying that this was supposed to be a supplemental, not a substitution. And the administration's using it as a substitution in many areas, not all, but many. So I look at the base budget request to see what is this administration's priorities. And to me, it says space is not that big of a priority. Now, within the Space Force budget, in the base budget, O&M funding, operation and maintenance goes up slightly. Okay, so that recognizes, that they see the need to, improve our readiness and operations. You see military personnel accounts go up. Part of that is due to the pay raises that are kicking in, but part of that is due to growing in strength, military in strength as well. Procurement is basically flat. They did go down a couple of launches in the base budget. It's RDT&E for the Space Forces where they took the biggest hit. And in particular, the vast majority of the cut was in the classified RDT&E program line. So that's what's interesting, except we don't know the details in order to be able to talk about it. But it says that there was something in there that is now a much lower priority for the administration than previously had been the case.
Fletcher, what was your takeaway here?
First and foremost, I respect everybody, all the other panelists as well.
Whether we deserve it or not.
It's well deserved. And Mike Gruss too. The things that stuck out to me, I think it's a little bit debatable how much of this is congressional priority versus the administration's priorities, or down at the warfighter level priorities. But again, things that stuck out to me: a real emphasis on proliferated low Earth orbit constellations and capabilities, which I do see as something that translates into force lethality. Not just the Space Force, but the Joint Force. There is a emphasis, break down each program, but there were some plus ups for space domain awareness capabilities, operations and systems, or I should say year-over-year increases, excuse me. And a huge emphasis on missile warning and also other remote sensing capabilities. I recall looking at the first time I ever looked in it was still the Air Force budget for a client project about remote sensing, electro-optical stuff, and there wasn't really anything in there, right? It's just the missile warning, infrared satellites, and geo. Now we've got a half a dozen program elements for different modalities of remote sensing and LEO. And of course, MEO and GEO are still there. So I do see a real mission focus here as a priority. And honestly, I think it's pretty well aligned across Congress, the services themselves, the end users, and the administration. Everybody wants that.
I was talking to someone last year, or I'm sorry, a couple months ago, and they said modality may be the word of the year for 2025. So interesting you say that. We've touched on this already with reconciliation, and I'm going to not be super delicate about asking this question, but Fletcher, why is this? What makes this year so weird? Why is this budget so different from other budgets? Because I think going back several cycles, it feels like, well, this one's not like the last one. It's hard to compare apples to. I think we've heard that for a number of years. But what makes this one different? And for our viewers who are trying to say, hey, how do I make sense of this?
The way the budget documents are, and I promise I won't go too deep into this part, but there's been a line for a long time of oversee contingency operations, and it sat right in the middle of base request and total request. And as that color of money went away, I expected that middle line to come out. But now this year, you have instead plopped right in the middle is the reconciliation funds. And this is the first budget I've seen where in the current year, right, the year in which funds are requested, you already have funds there. So it's not just what's being requested, but this presumed we have these dollars. So that is unique in and of itself. Speaking to the broader process, what makes it unique is how that happened timing wise. The administration comes in, has a pretty well baked budget, has their opportunity to go change it as they see fit, go through this whole process of iterating between OMB and the Pentagon and the services. That's enough to be challenging in any given year. But then you have this entire additional set of appropriations coming in and getting baked into the budget request documents that really just shifts the whole dynamic, in my view. And how appropriators respond will be really interesting. Some subcommittees, the House has already released a markup now it's at the committee level. So if you try and track that line to line right now, there are many points of disconnect, just the dollar levels, the line numbers. So it's going to be an interesting process for how it all shakes out. And I'd be lying if I said I knew exactly how it's going to go today.
Todd, how about you? where, when you look at this budget, and, I think there's sometimes an exercise where we say, hey, this cycle is going to be a lot like, the 15 cycle, we try and pick a year and say this cycle is going to be a lot like this cycle. What makes this one so different and unique?
Yeah, I mean, as Fletcher said, it's the latest any budget request has ever been submitted, about 4.5, almost 5 months late. And that I've checked the numbers going all the way back to since presidential budget requests were first required by Congress back in like 1921. So this is the latest, but that was expected. And it usually is late, just not this late in the first year of a new administration. I think what is very different about this, in addition to everything Fletcher said about reconciliation, and I released a commentary earlier this week, asking the question, is reconciliation the new OCO? And I don't think it is for several reasons. But the other interesting thing about this that's very different is the first budget request of a new administration normally doesn't make that many big decisions. They normally stick fairly close to the last budget of the outgoing administration. Even when there's a change in party, you see that. This budget request, not just for the Space Force, but for overall for DoD, actually makes a lot of substantive changes relative to the last budget of the outgoing Biden administration. So that I think is very unique. And if you start digging down into the details, they've got itemized in there all of their DOGE related cuts and how those add up and how many personnel are affected. These are big changes. And I mean, the workforce changes on their own, I think, are unprecedented changes to make in one single year. With the breadth of personnel cuts that we're talking about. I think that this is.
Let's go into that for a minute, because we talked just before we started the web event here, but I know you've done some math there. Tell us what you found when it comes to those job cuts, because I think for those of us who watch pretty closely, I think it's been hard to track, and I think there's been some offices have been more willing to talk about than others. But what have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird that they did it this way, and it appears a lot of this was done at the last minute. But in the narrative of the different lines, they included statements saying, pursuant to executive order such and such, we made this many dollar amount reductions. For the civilian workforce executive order, I think it's like 14,210 is the number. They within the Space Force O&M budget documents, they list how many civilian positions were eliminated. And then within the Space Force RDT&E budget lines, they list how many the savings from the civilian workforce cuts, but they don't list the number of civilians. But so I went through and added up in the O&M documents, it adds up to about 225 civilian positions that were paid out of O&M money have been eliminated through these DOGE cuts. There's an roughly equal amount of money in civilian workforce reductions in RDT&E. So my estimate is it's probably around 400 to 450 total civilian personnel that have been cut. And that is nearly 10% of the Space Force civilian workforce that's been cut. And those cuts are already factored into the FY26 budget.
Yeah.
Mike, if I could quickly add,
go.
Just on top of those cuts to the civilian workforce, and Todd, I think you're getting at some of this, are the cuts to ANAS and FFRDCs as well. Some real rough math.
Some of our viewers out there, Fletcher, walk us through those acronyms.
Yeah, thank you for that. Advisory and Assistance Services and FFRDCs are federally funded research and development centers. So on the left-hand side, a lot of contractors that do ANAS services, as well as systems engineering and technology assistance, CETA support. And FFRDCs are folks like Aerospace Corporation. Those cuts, I'm not going to give a precise number, but it looks to be around between 150 and 200 million. There were some slight inconsistencies I haven't quite gotten all the way through. But yeah, that was another consistent with executive orders statement that's on, I mean, probably every other program element in RDT&E and procurement and O&M.
Yeah, and Fletcher, just consistent with that, we had a group of our interns go through and do all of the adding up, and I haven't had a chance to double check it all. But for the contractor workforce reductions pursuant to the DOGE executive order, we came up with 205 million within the Space Force, and then the civilian workforce reductions I was just talking about earlier, that was 85 million. If you assume a similar cost per person, then we're talking, somewhere around 1,000 or 1,100 total contractors that are being cut in this request, just for the Space Force.
Yeah. Mike, you touched on this earlier, but this is such a different budget. What do you expect to see? Where do you expect to see some pushback from Congress, and where are the areas that you expect? I mean, I think we've already gotten some hints here, but what are some areas where you expect there to be some discussion, or just outright like, hey, we're not going to do it this way?
Great question. I think it's also important to remember why we got to where we are with the reconciliation being necessary. I mean, we ended last fiscal year on a continuing resolution for the Department of Defense for the first time ever in its history. That was largely because even though the Congress had completed all of its appropriations work, at least in our world, right, on the underlying bills, they still proceeded with a CR, and the CR was at Fiscal Responsibility Act caps, right? Were still for fiscal year 25 statutory caps that Congress had placed on defense and non-defense spending. The reason reconciliation is really necessary is to, in my mind, they're seeking, like OCO, to avoid the statutory caps that they've placed on themselves, right? Congress has placed these caps, and in FY26, these caps are not even binding. They are non-binding guidance caps, but that is why we have this kind of almost artificial austere environment where there is this cap. So that's why we got to where we're at here to a certain extent. Congress always kind of has the ball in their court, right, to kind of avoid the cuffs that they've put on themselves. So they allowed reconciliation to happen. And we're starting to see the signs that there isn't, a tremendous concern over the underlying Space Force investments. The House Appropriators, granted, they marked before the budget was actually officially released, but they came out very supportive of the reconciliation initiative, saying very explicitly that their mark was done, in coordination with the efforts ongoing on the reconciliation bill. They explicitly endorsed the Golden Dome initiative and the role of, space-based capabilities therein. They raised a lot of concerns, though, right, about the scope of Golden Dome, the size of that investment, and that none of it's really been, to the congressional satisfaction, been documented with, clear program plans. We've seen estimates anywhere from 100 billion over 3 years to 500 billion over 20 years. So I think Congress will, as it always does, especially on the appropriator side, really be looking to hold their feet to the flame on the details behind these investments. But from the broad strokes perspective, this whole cycle from end of 25 through the beginning of 26 shows tremendous coordination between the two chambers in Congress and this administration, working hand in glove to kind of get the administration priorities across the finish line. And I don't see that changing over.
Yep. I want to get into some programmatic questions. We touched on Golden Dome there, but before we do that, I want to, and I'll throw this out to anyone who wants to tackle it in the group, but I think if you would have asked at the beginning of the year what the Space Force budget looks like and what role does Elon Musk play, especially as the special advisor to the president and to work with DOGE. And I was wondering, what, if any, effect do you see from that in this budget?
I mean, other than the DOGE cuts we just talked about, I don't think there's much of an impact here from Elon Musk. I mean, you could go on the NASA side of the budget, and I think it might be kind of anti-Elon at this point. But yeah, I think that, and honestly, I think DOGE a year from now, we won't be talking about it at all. I mean, this is a fad that's run its course, I think, and it will gradually fade away from all of our budget talk. But yeah, in terms of Golden Dome, we may have thought that, there'll be Golden Dome funding in this budget request, and there's not. There's just reconciliation funding. But I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is They haven't picked an architecture. And if you haven't picked an architecture, it's pretty hard to know what to request and where you want to put the money. I think the other reason is they knew they were going to get this reconciliation funding. So why bother putting any money in there at all? 25 billion for Golden Dome. Not all of that for space, obviously, but they've got all the money that they could work with for, at least I would say the next year or two, as they try to figure out what architecture they're going to select. And, there were thoughts in the beginning that Elon Musk might actually, what's that?
When do you expect an architecture decision?
When's General Gutlein going to get confirmed for the position? Because I think at this point, you've named a leader. You ought to let the leader actually get in the job to do the analysis, to make the decision on what architecture. So I would say, confirmation of General Gutlein plus 3 to 6 months.
Yeah. Well, and I want to get this question from the audience, and I think it's a good one, and I think it's something we've heard consistently from our readers, which is, what are your thoughts on the executability and realism of delivering Golden Dome? And given the scale and complexity, do you believe it's feasible within proposed timelines and budgets, or are we underestimating exactly what it will take? And I know, Todd, you have some thoughts there on what that means, and it starts with what the architecture looks like. Maybe you want to kick that off, and then we'll turn it over to Fletcher and Mike.
Yeah, I mean, what I've been telling people is, what will Golden Dome cost? Well, in the absence of an architecture, it'll cost whatever you want it to cost. You could do it for $1, you could do it for $1 trillion, right? It depends on, what are your objectives? What are you trying to build exactly? And, what's the capacity that you're trying to defend against? So yeah, we have to know the architecture. I will say this, what President Trump said in the Oval Office when they had the announcement, it was supposed to announce the architecture, but it didn't. President Trump rattled off, a timeline of finishing it before he leaves office, and $175 billion cost tag, and it would be a virtually impenetrable shield. That cost, schedule, and performance there, they don't match up. That's not doable. So let's be real. I think that this if you really want to have a robust homeland air and missile defense against the wide range of threats that we face, and have significant capacity, maybe not to intercept everything, but to intercept a good portion of what could be launched our way, I think you're looking at a generational investment. You're talking hundreds of billions of dollars over a decade, maybe 2 decades. I think that's what would be required. I think the space component of it will largely be sensors. I think they will figure out pretty quickly why we've never fielded space-based interceptors before. It's physics. When people actually run the numbers, and they start to realize, like, oh, that doesn't scale with the threat. So I think our interceptors will largely be on the ground side. There may be some Hail Mary investments in directed energy from space. That would be great if we can get that to work. But yeah, I think it's going to be a generational investment to do anything of the magnitude that President Trump seems to want.
If I could jump in, I totally agree with Todd's perspective there, and I think it to a certain extent underscores the risk that Todd was talking about earlier with the base budget. Meaning, if reconciliation and these budget mechanics go away, the architecture that they're talking about embarking on investing is not sustained by a base budget that declines in the way that Todd is referring to, right? They're going to need to be growing this budget year after year substantially in order to achieve what it is that they're looking to achieve. I will say that, folks like Space Systems Command have already, I think, initiated RFIs on things like space-based interceptors. To give a sense for the timeline, I think we're still in that, government evaluation phase of the technology and capabilities. Everybody that's way more experienced and smarter than me on the space-based components of this have underscored what Todd has said, that this is an extremely high technical challenge, that the timelines and dollars that we're talking about are substantial. I do think that this budget with reconciliation as a component sets the foundation for that, and really writes the first check of many that will need to be written in order to sustain. And with things like the Fiscal Responsibility Act, capping overall defense spending, that will be a challenge unless, congressional Republicans and the Trump administration relieve themselves of those handcuffs. Over.
Yeah. No
Go ahead.
major contentions here with my other panelists. I think I'd just point out there are elements that are quick wins, right? That you could field pretty quickly here. And I mean, we're talking like this fiscal year even, or this next fiscal year even, as long as industry is there to support it. The ground-based interceptors, like Todd pointed out, right? More THAADs, more GMD, that's doable. You have sensors, many layers of this architecture are programs that have been funded now for several years that are on their way to fielding. So these are elements that can build to something, some architecture that we'll see initial tranches maybe within the next 4 years, but some sort of full operational capability, as the others have pointed out, even if it's a pretty limited architecture, would be a challenge. Over.
Yeah. I want to go back to this point that I think Todd brought up about RDT&E funding. And, I think one thing that we've heard a lot from industry the last 6 months or so is there seems to be this kind of mismatch between this desire to use commercial more and to actually see what those contracts will look like and where the budgets will be for these, particularly startups or folks who are new entrants to the defense establishment. And so I wanted to know kind of how, and we can start with anyone here, but how do you guys make sense of that, hey, maybe there's been this desire to use commercial more, but that with the RDT&E budgets, that may or may not be a good fit.
I'll go first. I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, which has been pretty consistent the past few years, in my estimation. There are a number of programs, actually specific callouts, that got palmed this year that are for commercial services. But there are others where it's playing the same game, letting Congress add it in. The Space Force isn't going to program for it. That's pretty consistent, and I wouldn't actually call out any specific mission area as a big beneficiary versus those that are losing out, because it has seemed to change over the years. Things like tech SRT, so more your remote sensing work, space domain awareness data. It can change year to year, but there are a lot of positives. CASR, the Commercial Augmentation Space Reserve, has a nice plug this year. So for FY26, but you do see other programs, even ones where they are using middle tier acquisition authorities and supposed to favor more commercial companies. Even the acquisition strategy saying, leveraging commercial, perhaps even entertaining commercial, government owned, commercially operated. But the dollars are primarily flowing to our larger, more traditional defense contractors or some of the most established sort of enterprise firms. So again, a little bit of a mixed bag, but there are commitments in several areas. They might just not be very long-term commitments, which would be particularly hard to discern in this year's budget, not having a FYDP projection, which I realize I forgot to mention up front.
Yeah.
I mean,
Todd,
Mike, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think commercial will always have like a seat at the table when it comes to DoD space. They, I think, genuinely see where and when they, through their lens, view commercial as either augmentative or supplemental, or in some cases doing the underlying core mission. But when it comes to some of the nature of the DoD space investments, there is a pretty big distance between commercial capability and that which the DoD is looking to acquire. Whether you're talking about nuclear command and control, secure communications from space, or really, and this kind of gets to your original question, Mike, a lot of the investments that were really kind of funded in this reconciliation boost, right, this huge increase, are in the classified world. They're in the space control world. They're in long-range kill chains. Those are not commercial capabilities. So to the broader picture, I think, having a proper calibration of where the market opportunity is in DoD and commercial entities focusing on those areas and not trying to push the military kind of uphill because that won't work.
Yeah,
Well,
one thing I agree with what Fletcher and Mike both said. One thing I would add is a lot depends on your definition of commercial. And you know, that's important. I think that some people when in the government, when they're talking commercial, sometimes they mean commercially owned, commercially operated systems, buying something as a service like imagery or data, as you know, space domain awareness data. Other times when you hear people in government say, oh, we're leveraging commercial, they're leveraging commercially developed technology, but to acquire a government-owned and government-operated and government-spec'd system. They just are being informed by what's commercially available in terms of components and subsystems. And so, I mean, you've got very different approaches there. I mean, it's like, you know, the Space Development Agency, are they really leveraging commercial when they're writing the specs for all the components that go on their satellites? They're leveraging some commercial business model companies, although that is changing as those companies get bought up or partner with traditional primes. So yeah, I think that there are just big, you know, big gaps in how people define commercial.
You know, I want to bring this, one of the questions we have touched on this, but, you know, I think we've seen reporting that one of the Trump nominees for space policy has advocated for merging the National Reconnaissance Office and Space Systems Command. You know, does that solve or does that help some of these problems that we're talking about here when it comes to classified, or does it only muddy the water and add to the bureaucracy? And obviously we always have classification issues. You know, what's your quick thought there?
And I will say, I think that position is actually kind of a return to where we have been historically. I believe the NRO, the director of the NRO, was previously dual-hatted, kind of in that similar capacity. So I think that's where a lot of that comes from, is a belief that having that kind of entire space enterprise under one hat would provide, you know, degrees of efficiencies in operation and mission capability development. I think we're probably a pretty far way off of that, just in terms of just when Space Force was created, you know, there was a lot of just explicit language from Congress that said that ain't happening. So, you know, I think it's an open question. The argument will have to be, you know, convinced on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, and I would note in the House Appropriations bill, they included specific language again that said no funding can be used for like trying to incorporate the NRO and the Space Force together. But that said, I tend to agree that long term, we're going to need a separate department of the Space Force. And underneath that, I think you would have a military branch and an intel branch that would be the NRO. I think there is going to need to be some sort of integration. But in the meantime, the first step is we could go back to what we used to do and have an undersecretary of the Department of the Air Force focused on space that is dual-hatted as director of the NRO.
Yeah, and that's something
another good question here, and we've talked, and we'll use my word, which is, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say the Undersecretary for Space is something that we at NSSA have, you know, published an issue paper on. It's kind of elevating almost the acquisition and integration position that was created at the Assistant Secretary level inside of OSD, you know, inside of Space Force to, you know, the Undersecretary position to have a senior civilian that is the space civilian underneath, you know, the Secretary of the Air Force, that, and adding a dual hat kind of NRO to that would be even another layer. Over.
You know, one question we have with some of the, again, use the word weird, with some of the weirdness this year is someone from the audience asked, do you expect a pause in buying activity, particularly when it comes to Golden Dome, until we have a decision on the architecture? Are any of you seeing a slowing of purchasing, or are you expecting that? Or is this just, has industry figured out, hey, this is kind of what it's going to look like and we have to plan accordingly?
Well, I would say that one piece of intel that's important is that, you know, as I noted earlier, FY25 ended under a continuing resolution, first time ever for the Department of Defense. There was language in that bill that directed the department to coordinate with Capitol Hill on any necessary reprogrammings to get things to where they need to be. And the House Appropriations Committee indicated to us that they already sought that and pulled forward, effectively pulled out of that 25 CR money to initiate Golden Dome, right? So the Golden Dome had about 80 million of the 25 CR money reprogrammed and reallocated to it to get things moving, right? So I think the idea that there will be a pause, I think, is not necessarily the way I would characterize it. I think there's, like Fletcher indicated, there's a lot that they can do under the broad umbrella of Golden Dome that can keep things moving. And they certainly have a lot of, cash at their disposal through the FY25 mandatory spending, which is now being, reflected in the 26 budget. But effectively, that's money that they have to spend.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, that the reconciliation money is FY25 money. It's available now. They could start spending it. I think what's going to slow it down is not having an architecture selected yet. But there are piece parts of it that you can go ahead and say, you know what, we're going to need more THAAD. We're going to need more Patriot. We're going to need more missile warning satellites, regardless of what architecture we pick. So you could go ahead and start some of those contract actions, but that money can be obligated today, and it is good through the end of fiscal year 29. So it is good money. It's got a long shelf life.
I want to go back to some of the programmatic, getting into the nitty gritty here a little bit. And Fletcher, maybe we'll start with you here, but like, what's one area in maybe one program or one series of programs in the budget that you saw that you thought, hey, this is interesting, this is different. I'm curious to see what the reaction on the Hill is going to be to this, and the reaction from industry.
You give me an inch, I'm going to take like half a mile and go with two. The first I already mentioned a bit, but kind of rolled up within long range kill chains a bit is GMTI, as well as some additional proliferated low Earth orbit communications capabilities, right? It's a little bit distinct from data transport from SDA. But those in particular, the dollar amounts attached, I mean, we are talking about additional hundreds of satellites for kind of new purposes, GMTI in particular. And that's one instance where, not wholesale, if I understand the comments from Space Force and Air Force leadership correctly, not wholesale replacing airborne capability, but certainly making a major shift to the space layer. Talk about, Mike's use of unprecedented. So those are very interesting. They are large dollar programs. And I think there's a lot more that still needs to come out about the acquisition strategies publicly, as well as the architectures. And I think there will be a lot will still be held behind the veil of secrecy, but because they're out in the open to some extent in the budget justification documents and what these government leaders have been saying over really the past cycle and a half, I think that a lot more will be made available. The second one I'll throw in is SAML, right? Space access, mobility, and logistics are also kind of Venn diagram overlap with ISAM in space servicing, assembly, manufacturing. There's a dedicated program line for SAML that, if I'm not mistaken, is very low funded, if not unfunded in the request. But this has traditionally or historically been an area where Congress provides funds, congressional ads for a few years now. There's an interesting, I would say, sprinkling of funds for SAML activities outside of that program line in the sort of earlier RDT&E phases, budget activities like 1, 2, 3. Things like refueling, in space refueling activities. You do see the continuation of point-to-point delivery, rocket cargo, and now I guess dropping cargo from orbit is the newest one. So lots of interesting stuff, not all confined to that one program line. So that's something I keep an eye on. Also, just connecting it back to commercial. I mean, SAML is an area where, for the Space Force's commercial space strategy, they really want that one to be under their definition of commercially led.
Yep. Todd, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of interest in this airborne moving target indication mission area or airborne warning mission, and in particular because in the Air Force's budget request, they zeroed out funding for the AWACS replacement plane, the E-7. And you know, the thinking there, the E-7 all along was supposed to be kind of a gap filler until we had a space-based capability, because even the Air Force recognized we're not going to be able to do airborne warning from an airborne platform very effectively much longer. I mean, we can't even really do it anywhere close to a contested airspace right now anyway. So yeah, they have been moving in that direction, but the Air Force's budget seems to indicate the administration wants to accelerate that transition to space. But then, you know, you look at funding in the Space Force's budget, this ambiguously named program line, long range kill chains, that's where moving target indications seem to go. It did in the base budget, it does go up. Last year, they had projected that for 26, they would have about 250 million in funding. And this year in their base budget, they put they put very little, 1.9 million, but its reconciliation then filled the coffers. And so reconciliation put 1.3 million in the same budget activity as GMTI, but then another 6.4 billion in this new budget activity for long range kill trains. You know, is that going to be part of Golden Dome? Is it going to be part of this airborne warning mission moving to the Space Force? It's not clear. I can tell you, though, it makes me nervous because given how slowly the Space Force has moved on ground moving target indication, taking 3 years to get to milestone B, which is the official start of an acquisition program. Yep. 3 years just to start the program. I don't have a lot of confidence they're going to be able to move expeditiously on an airborne warning constellation of satellites. And maybe there's some overlap with the GMTI. But yeah, I would be very worried about this.
Mike, how about you? What's a program or a couple of programs that you're keeping an eye on and you're excited to see what happens to?
Well, I will say, you know, kind of like Todd started with, right? When we get our budget, the first thing that we're looking at are new lines, like what's new investment, where's new money going, and then where are the cuts? How much of the existing architectures and infrastructures are suffering, you know, reductions, and where are those? So this is where, you know, when you really get into the meat and potatoes of the request, you know, you look at something like the Space Situation Awareness Systems line. This is a line that generally funds development of the department's terrestrial-based radar capabilities that inform the space situational space domain awareness mission. You know, in the 26 base request, it went from 455 million last year to $1 million. But all of that existing, what was 25 traditional base programmatic funding, for some reason, they mechanically moved literally nearly 100% of that in, and it was you know, made up for in the reconciliation request. That's, you know, very in passing stated in the budget request documents, but that's effectively just moving the money over and not a real cut to the base budget. To Todd's earlier point, it looks like a cut, right? But they are now just, you know, doing it in the request as being reflected in, we're using this money over here for that initiative. So there's every reason to think that that would move, you know, they're not going to walk away from Deep Space Advanced Radar concept, GBOS, things of that nature. And then really on the new lines, right, we're talking, there's billions of dollars of new investment in things like the, you know, long range kill chain. This is on top of, you know, prior year investments. We're talking sizable percentage increases in investments in things like long range kill chains and ground moving target indicator, as Todd, those are really exciting. There's also, like, you know, as we enter this new wave of capability, the emphasis on mesh architectures, cross-link communication, that system of systems approach, I think that fingerprint is throughout this budget. Those investments aren't going anywhere. That sustainment, that integration money is another area of continued strong investment.
Yep, system of systems, one of my favorite Space Force terms. I want to ask, because we have a couple questions here about space superiority in China, and just I think they're kind of following on a couple themes. One, how do you keep up with China if it's as Todd says, a declining budget? Two, you know, is there is there budget here to make the advancements needed to create an environment where the Space Force can operate satellites as it needs? Or, I think they've phrased this very delicately, but essentially, are they prepared for a conflict in space? And so I guess my question again to the panel is, what do you see when it comes to space superiority in this budget, and that you think, hey, this is going to be a priority of this administration?
Fletcher, do you want to take the shift that's occurred?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, it's not the space superiority you necessarily might be asking about, Mike, but sheer numbers, right? There's a clear shift in the strategy here to gain superiority through larger proliferated architectures, right? We have more satellites, more eyes, more sensors. We can see more, we can talk better than you can through our space architecture. And to Mike's point about system of systems, mesh architectures, right? Actual commitment this year in dedicated project lines for doing that, hybrid space architectures, starting to connect not just military to military or military to intel, but including industry capabilities, right? Privately or commercially owned and operated systems. That is hands down the most public way we can speak to part of the space superiority strategy. You do see, and I think Todd enumerated and Mike enumerated, at least funding level shifts. We don't know the precise activities, but there are program lines for space control. Not a lot of details, but there's money there. Yeah, can't obviously speak to the specific details.
Yeah, and I would say that the shift that I've seen from administration to administration is this administration is leaning forward and more open about talking about the U.S. policy position of exerting space superiority and space control. Prior administrations were not as forthcoming. I think there's a good strategic deterrence, reasoning behind that. And I think a lot of the funding that you saw in whether it's the reconciliation bill or not, right? There's a shift to classified Space Force money. And you have to think that a lot of that is going to the space control mission. This is not a declining mission. This is a priority where they're talking about it more. They're talking about it more aggressively, and they seem to be investing in those capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is in terms of space superiority and space control, if there's significant activity there, it must be in the classified budget, because you don't see a whole lot in the unclassified budget. You see bits and pieces, and largely when they talk about space control in the past, they really just mean looking at things, space domain awareness, not actually being able to control something. So yeah, if they've got programs that actually can exert control, exert force in space, it's probably going to be in the classified funding lines. But then that's where it gets really interesting. If only we could know, what was it that they cut more than $3 billion out of the classified R&D for the Space Force in the base budget? What were they cutting? Was that offset by the reconciliation classified funding, or was the reconciliation funding for something different than what they cut? So that's kind of the big unknown here. Certainly the rhetoric has changed, though, that they're talking much more about space superiority and space control, although it does bug me every time I hear some Space Force officers say, we used to not be allowed to talk about this. Who told you you were not able to talk about it? I'd like to know their name. No one can ever give me a name of who told them they couldn't say that before. So a lot of it, I think, is myth, but they are coming out more and feeling more comfortable talking about these things.
Yeah.
One more question here. If I think there's a series of notes from viewers who say kind of, hey, if I'm a small company, how should I be thinking about this budget? If I'm a medium company, or if I'm a prime, what are the different levels? How are they viewing this budget? What are you hearing from the folks and you talk to? How are they seeing this budget in industry from all sorts of different perspectives? Mike, do you want to start there?
Sure. I mean, I think, the big elephant in the room is Golden Dome and all this reconciliation funding. So whether you're a small, medium, or large, a lot of the focus in this immediate short term has been understanding what the heck is happening, right? What is the architecture? How much money is at play? And then, frankly, a lot of B2B, right? Working to position yourself for where you might fit as a company into that capability. I don't think that that's going away. I think the companies are right to position themselves now to not miss the boat, right, on that potential investment. So that's really in the immediate short term where a lot of our clients' focus have been on, our member companies' focus have been on, is where can we fit into the Golden Dome? If we're too small to be a prime, we don't have the capability to be a major player. Who do we team with to be a part of that ecosystem? Because that is going to be a priority investment for the, as we've discussed, for the foreseeable future.
Fletcher.
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of Mike's points. Maybe just to get a bit more granular, like if I'm a tier 2 or tier 3 supplier, I see a lot of opportunity here. The number of satellites required for some of these, I mean, even if you only got through, say, an initial tranche of satellites, like that's a really nice book order. So there's that aspect of it, but going back to modality, right? Radar, there's a lot here for you. Electro-optical, there are programs here for you. I think might have been joking with you, Mike Tierney, but this is the first time I've ever seen ultraviolet mentioned in the Space Force's RDT&E budget, right? It's super interesting. So maybe not any new news for our larger primes, larger commercial firms necessarily, but certainly down the value chain, just one or two steps, I see a lot of opportunity.
Todd, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just add, I also hear a lot of kind of opportunity from industry, mainly because of Golden Dome, but also a lot of uncertainty about what is the architecture they're going to pick. How can a company fit into that? And what's going to happen in FY27 if we don't get another reconciliation bill? Are they going to hold the space budget, Space Force budget at 26 billion? So we're going to go from, total with reconciliation of 40 billion down to 26. It's going to crash. Or are we going to see the base budget start to come up? Maybe we get a second reconciliation bill after the midterms. I think you can count that possibility out entirely. But yeah, just a lot of uncertainty about whether these things will continue.
Well, we're just about out of time. I want to do one quick lightning round, and Todd, I'm going to start with you here, which is let's pretend we're talking maybe not 12 months from now, but maybe 10. Maybe it's a little bit, budget comes out a little bit closer on time next year. Give me one prediction for kind of what you expect to see in the next 12 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Russ Vought is still the budget director, I think the overall DoD top line is going to continue to be flat in nominal terms. That's what I would expect to see, and that's going to force a lot of painful choices in the budget coming down from the sugar high of reconciliation.
Yeah, we didn't get to talk about your use of the word sugar high, but really enjoyed that last week. Fletcher, how about you? What's one prediction for the next 12 months when it comes to the budget here?
At some point, there's going to be another continuing resolution. That's an easy one.
Yep.
Boo.
I think what would be really nice to see would be some of these newer programs actually deploying initial tranches. So maybe it's not the next year, right? But maybe towards the end of it, right? Acquisition strategies come out, architectures are defined. Someone actually moves fast and puts a demo up there. That would be phenomenal.
Yep. All right, Mike, I'm going to give you the last word here. What's one thing to expect in the next 12 months that might be?
I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say there will be a bigger, beautifuler bill 2.0, and or they will relieve some of the Fiscal Responsibility Act cuffs on them to give them the ability to just do what they want instead of using budgetary gimmicks to get around it.
Great. Well, hey, Todd, Mike, Fletcher, thank you very much for doing this. I think it was great. I know our viewers and listeners learned a lot, and Thank you for your questions. A quick note that this is being recorded. It'll be available online on spacenews.com. And thanks again to everyone for tuning in. Have a great day.